I shall start with an overall picture of what's happening, although I'm sure the other comrades will give their own overall picture too. But as I said, since I'm opening up, I think I should do it that way. As you probably know, Workers' World Party's position is that capitalism is at a dead end, which means that the capitalist system, the capitalist economy worldwide is not developing by normal ways, by the ways capitalism usually does. When it has a downturn, it then has an upswing after that. This is not happening. There is no upswing. There is only there's some variations, but the general trend is down. Europe, in fact, the development is flat, if not negative. And the European capitalists, the big imperialist powers in Western Europe, have zero growth overall. The United States seems to have escaped some of the worst of this, although you wouldn't know that from talking to 40–50% of the workers whose salaries have gotten low if they're lucky enough to have a job. But this has intensified the class struggle on a worldwide scale. It's intensified it with the class struggle here, but even more so, it's intensified it in an international way on the question of imperialist war. In order to assure the continued flow of money, in order to into the imperialist centers, into especially U.S. imperialism, which is the main central empire, the big imperialist power in the world today, in this system that is dominated by imperialism, in order to ensure their control of it, in order to ensure that they can print as many dollars as they need, they have to be the ruling class here has to be in control of the world's resources and the world's markets. This puts them into conflict in any area of the world where any country is trying to be sovereign, independent. And in fact, they're on a mission, the ruling class here is on a mission to recolonize those areas of the world which managed to free themselves during the period, mainly right after World War II, for about 40 years, when there existed a Soviet Union. So the U.S. is now engaged in military conflict, leaving Israel aside for the moment, though that is almost an extension of the imperialist power and the conflict in Gaza. But it has military forces, or is about to intervene, or has intervened in where there is fighting in Ukraine, in Iraq, in Syria, still in Afghanistan, and yeah, that's about it now. Also in North Africa. Did I leave something out? What are you saying? Somalia. Oh, that's right. They just hit some. They made a drone hit in Somalia, right? And in all of North Africa, which, because the imperialists intervened in 2011, overthrew the existing stable government, and set off a whole series of civil wars, and so there's no stability there either. So all throughout that region, there's conflict. I'm going to speak specifically about Syria and Iraq. I think Sarah will talk more about Gaza and Ukraine. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Before discussing it, though, I want to make it very clear where we stand. We are a revolutionary workers' party, and our position toward imperialism is a Leninist position. And that means we're for the defeat of imperialism wherever it intervenes and against whoever it intervenes. We're for the defeat of imperialism. This is independent of who they happen to be fighting, and it doesn't mean that we always identify completely with the forces that are fighting against them, but it does mean we're for the defeat of the imperialists. With regard to Syria and Iraq, we are opposed to any increased, in fact, we want the U.S. to get completely out of there. We're opposed to any intervention, whatever pretext they give the imperialists and their media, which is a complete dominant one-sided media that only reflects the interest of the wealthy ruling class over here, doesn't reflect the interest, is not neutral, doesn't reflect the interests of any workers, doesn't reflect the interests of any other peoples. They reflect the interests of the billionaires who and dominate this country. So everything that's said by the politicians and everything that's repeated by ad nauseum by the media is their position. Most of it is just lies. But even when it's not lies, it's their point of view of what's going on. So, as I said, whatever the pretext, and the pretext this time now, it sort of has varied from day to day, or month to month anyway. For a while it was to save the Yazidi or Christian minorities in Iraq that were supposedly threatened, probably were threatened by a grouping called now calls itself the Islamic State, which is as far as I can tell and what I can figure out from the media, is a continuation of a fundamentalist, religious, and therefore ideological formation that now seems to have control some territory in Iraq and maybe some in Syria too. And the excuse that the imperialists are giving for having to intervene is that they have to destroy this evil body. This has now become the main enemy. You might remember that a year ago the Assad government in Syria was supposed to be terrible, killing its own people, etc., etc., etc. It was supposed to be the most evil thing in the world. Now that's no longer the main brunt of the thing. In fact, the Assad government is fighting against the Islamic State inside Syria. Also, Iran was supposed to be this bad, evil thing, and now there's even talk of, I wouldn't say an alliance, but at least some working arrangement. And it's supposed to be the Islamic State that's the enemy. Now, we must remember, the United States and its monarchist allies in Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and some of the other Gulf Emirates, they helped to arm and fund the Islamic State, or its predecessor, that same ideological current, which really grows out of Saudi Arabia, but that's not where it's focused right now. They utilized this force in the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and they armed elements in it to fight against the Soviet Union, which was aiding a progressive government in Afghanistan. They've used that force in Libya, armed it, gave it air cover in order to overthrow the Gaddafi government in Libya. However, it is also an enemy. It's also almost the perfect enemy for the United States. They use it as an enemy to make an excuse to intervene. They're so bad, they're so terrible, have to send in the Marines. No, they don't send in the Marines these days. They send in drones and airplanes right now because the Obama administration knows that there is a great deal of resistance amongst the U.S. population, especially amongst the working class and the oppressed nationalities that live within the U.S., who live within the U.S., to having their youth die in a war over there. This has been true through much of the last 40, 50 years. And even more so, even a few thousand troops dying causes a lot of resistance in the U.S. population. So the Obama administration is faced with this contradiction. They want to intervene, they want to use the air power of the United States, and may eventually have to send troops. I think we have to keep that in mind, that there is always a good possibility that as it develops, the only way they can control the situation is by using actual U.S. troops. They don't have reliable puppet regimes that can, provide the people power, the war power in there. They have actually not been able to succeed in winning any of the wars that they've started in the last, well, really since Iraq. Afghanistan, they haven't been able to settle it and set up what they would like. What the imperialists would like is a reliable client government that works with them and leaves it open for the imperialists to exploit the resources of the area and exploit also the labor and have a market. In the area that I'm speaking about, mainly in Syria and Iraq, the main goal is to take control of the energy resources. What they have managed to do mainly is to stop the energy resources, but they haven't been able to take it over yet. So now there's the question of, will there be an intervention? But let me say a little more about who those forces are over there and what the United States plans. The New York Times published an editorial on August 25th calling upon the Obama administration to form an imperialist coalition. We're a coalition of all the imperialists. They don't want to do it alone. That was the Times advice. And it seems to be more or less what Kerry wrote about and what the Obama is planning to intervene, but to get other forces with him. So they want to get British and French intervention. They've managed to get already intervention in the sense of sending weapons into the north of Iraq to the Kurdistan region. Kurdistan is the only section. The Kurdistan government in Iraq is made up of parties that have had a close relationship with the CIA since the 1970s, really. And it was the area of Iraq that was most quickly conquered and where they were able to set up a puppet government. And right now, even though there was a lot of turmoil in the south and with the central government that was run by another U.S. puppet, someone that the U.S. got in, Maliki, he is pulled back. But for the last 8 years, this government that was put in has been unable to establish itself as a stable government in the south of Iraq. But in the north, it's stable. So in Erbil, which is the capital of that region, there has been a building boom. I don't know if you know much about it, but if you look up stuff about it, almost all the big imperialist countries have built consulates in Erbil. In other words, they have a mission, they have their embassy in Baghdad, but in Erbil they have built big consulates. The United States has a big consulate with a couple of thousand people working there. So you mean that they have a defense force for it, they have their CIA, they have everybody there. And all the businesses started to set up in Iraq, in Kurdistan, which controls about 1/3 of the oil resources of what used to be Iraq, or what is Iraq. So even when a few weeks ago Obama was saying, oh, we have to go in to help the people over there, they're doing terrible things to the Christians, they're doing terrible things to the Yazidis, they're all caught on a mountain, and so we're coming to help. It turned out that had nothing to do. This was a complete pretext as far as the United States was concerned. All they were concerned about really was defending Erbil, to make sure that this army did not seize that part of Iraq. In fact, the Obama administration, when they finally got to the mountain, they found that most of the people had been taken off the mountain. Who took them off the mountain? Not them. Not the Kurdistan Peshmerga, which is the army of the Kurdistan group, but it was guerrilla fighters from the Workers' Party of Kurdistan, which is the the Kurdish movement inside Turkey and the Kurdish movement inside Syria. They were the ones who took them off. These groups are considered terrorists by the West, yet they were the ones who did the rescue. No. Now, who was there? I was trying to follow closely what was happening in Iraq, because there was when the U.S. went into Iraq, it took over the country very quickly, but also in 2003. So much so that, remember Bush, he got up on May 1st, he landed on some aircraft carrier, and he said, mission accomplished. That was his big thing. That was like a joke for the next 5 years, because the Iraqis set up a resistance, and there was quite a powerful resistance in 2004 and 2005 that really stopped the United States cold, inflicted a lot of casualties on the occupation troops that were there. And the only way that the U.S. was able to keep it from being a complete debacle was that they did a divide and conquer. They set up the constitution of the new Iraq so that it exacerbated any differences that existed. Shia and Sunni had their own parties. You had to identify that way. The Kurds had their own. And it kept the thing different. And who knows what they did with, commandos and underground movement, killing one or the other and blaming it on the other, until there was actually fighting going on between the different groups in Iraq. And they took advantage of this, and then they had they had the surge. They put more U.S. troops in, and a lot of the people involved in the resistance were on one side fighting these reactionary Islamic forces. Well, they're not Islamic. They're a reactionary force. And they were fighting against the government, against the puppet government. And they felt they couldn't do both. So they made a deal. And a lot of them fought, especially the tribal forces, fought against the Al-Qaeda type people, and they defeated them, but they did it sort of in agreement. A lot of them were being paid by the United States. And then the government, then the U.S. pulled out, and the Maliki government excluded almost all those forces. Anyone that was any relationship to the Ba'ath Party, which was, where Saddam Hussein was in, and which was the government of Iraq from the 1960s until 2003. Which was a bourgeois nationalist grouping, and fought somewhat for the sovereignty of Iraq, but it was a bourgeois force. And they were very active in the resistance, because that's who was thrown out. And then the U.S. came out, and this new government in there was unstable, and wasn't able to control the situation, and the imperialist oil companies and all couldn't exploit all of Iraq the way they had wanted to in the beginning of the war. Then an uprising started, sort of coincident with the Arab Spring, and it burst out in there were a lot of peaceful demonstrations, unarmed demonstrations, and they were attacked by the Maliki government and bombed and blown up and stuff like that. And then these forces went into revolt in the spring of this year. But among the forces, besides the Baathists and besides the tribal groups, was this Islamic State, and they were a dynamic part of that force. And it was hard for me to follow at the beginning time who was going to control this movement. It seems like the Islamic State has the upper hand this time in it, but I really don't know what other forces are involved over there and who exactly the U.S. is interested in intervening against. But that they want to intervene is what we opposed. Let's go back. See, the U.S., as I said, oh, okay. U.S., it's a confusing situation, right? Because who was their enemy last year is now not as big an enemy. Who was their one that they were working with or allowing to exist and allowing to fight against the Syrians is now painted as the big enemy. And I brought up in an editorial I wrote, from the earlier period, there was a British statesperson named Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli. And he said, to express what British imperialism wanted, we have no permanent friends, we have no permanent enemies, we just have permanent interests. So, in the situation in Syria and Iraq, also in Ukraine and in Libya, and in Somalia, they can change who their enemy is. They can change who the propaganda, the propaganda of who they're attacking. They, in fact, but their interest stays the same. The interest is to reconquer and recolonize those regions of the world that managed to free themselves. That interest stays the same. That's what the U.S. is for, and we are opposed to that, no matter where it shows up and no matter who their enemy is. So, as I said before, we would be working for the defeat of any U.S. intervention, and over here, of course, we will fight to try and stop any intervention and to mobilize the forces that we can mobilize to prevent the intervention from happening, and should it happen, and should they try to bring more troops in it, we will try to prevent that from happening. We take great heart in what the comrades and many other allies did on the West Coast with regard to the Israelis, when they actually were able to stop the delivery of Israeli goods on a ship. We would want to be able to stop the delivery of goods, the delivery of weapons. We would want to be able to do that if we possibly could. This would be our goal, our orientation, and where we take our stand. Opposition to U.S. imperialism, no matter where it intervenes in the world, and no matter against whom it intervenes. And we have to know that there can be changing alliances, and we can see people who are our allies one day, maybe they won't be quite the same in a different situation, but we are always opposed to U.S. imperialism, just like Lenin and the real revolutionaries opposed all the sides in World War I. We will oppose all the big imperialist forces that are in combat in the world today. Thank you.